just being on your podcast and talking about it, you provide the material for all the Christian reaction channels.
This is not a drill, people. There's 2 YouTubers with millions of subscribers talking about why they're not Christians. This is an all-hands-on-deck situation, apologists. I need Sean McDowell and William Lane Craig. I need Ruslan KD. I need David Wood. I need Inspiring Philosophy, John McCrae, Gavin Ortland, Cameron Bertuzzi, Eric Manning, Van Christopoulos, Dr. Stephen Boyce. I'm even going to need an apostate prophet. Yeah, he's a Christian now.
Hey guys, did you know I'm a Christian now?
Keep up. We've got real apostates to put down before they infect the flock.
Oh, sure.
This is what they feed off of, right? This is what they want. If we're talking about this, they want to talk about us talking about it.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians.
It's usually atheists and skeptics that wake up and say, see, when I was a Christian, when I was a theist, when I was at this, when I was at that, I was wrong, I was disillusioned, and they're disillusioned.
And today, that means looking at almost every Christian apologist you've ever heard of responding to a fellow former Christian, because Alex O'Connor's recent episode,
Rhett McLaughlin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
sent online apologists into a tizzy that I've never before seen the likes of.
At the time we're recording this, it has well over 2 million views and has created quite the conversation and stir online.
It drew out the big guns.
I don't run primarily reaction video channel, but now and then videos come up. I thought, you know what? If Bill is available to come on and respond with me to this, this would be perfect.
There was this sober take from Gavin, taking the conversation to heart.
Alex O'Connor recently interviewed Rhett McLaughlin, and it raised a lot of points that Christians need to consider, I think, especially Christian apologists, which would be someone like me.
To the self-aware problematic version.
But if you really want a gentle, kind, humble response, check out my guy, Gavin Ortland. He really does capture the tone and the heart, I think, of how we should engage in these conversations. This video might be a little different.
To a dismissive cartoon avatar.
In a recent podcast, Rhett McLaughlin chatted with atheist Alex O'Connor. When they got to discussing the resurrection, the takes were pretty rough.
I should know. You can't trust dismissive cartoons. You need dismissive people who show their face.
His arguments didn't just raise objections. They exposed just how shaky his objections to Christianity actually are.
Or you could assemble your bros.
And I was like, well, I'll just get these 3 knuckleheads to come in here and help me with this. So
For somebody who rejects Jesus, why does he look so much like him?
Sorry, you think Jesus was white, Eric?
Or you could do, well, whatever this was.
There was a interview that happened on Alex O'Connor's channel, Cosmic Skeptic, with a guy named Rhett McLaughlin. I don't even know how to pronounce his last name. McLaughlin.
Oh,
He's a very famous YouTuber, though. McLovin. Very famous YouTuber over at, I need to look up his name. Let's see, Rhett. This is like the best way to start a live stream.
And guys, let me tell you about this topic, which I actually have.
Which I don't know anything about.
Whatever.
Amateur hour.
Yeah, my thoughts are just that McLovin is kind of a weird name, yeah. But I don't know anything about him, so.
There's something about him that's like kind of beautiful though. Like he's got this
kind of cool
really
looking.
Beautiful hair. His his outfits and stuff look pretty cool.
A mane like a lion. And a super dope beard. This guy could play in some movie about Jesus.
Yeah.
Don't worry, the awkward bromances will continue. So what I'm doing is taking the responses of 12 apologists in 7 videos, making up more than a total of 7.25 hours of reacting, and looking at it all in this one handy response video. Obviously, that means I'm not covering everything that was said. After some preamble, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the back and forth about Jesus' alleged resurrection.
I know, I'm legitimately interested in this if he has an alternative view of the resurrection.
Yeah, you're going to be very underwhelmed. Let's
really?
watch.
Oh, darn.
when he gets to the resurrection argument, I was just like,
Yeah.
Yes.
no,
Yeah, no.
The way he presented the resurrection argument is the way atheists present the resurrection argument. It is not a steel man at all of how we argue for it. It was abysmally bad.
So stay tuned for that.
Did Alex O'Connor and Rhett strawman Christianity on Resurrection Sunday?
Why I Left Christianity by Rhett McLaughlin of Rhett and Link, and they have a channel that's got 19 million followers.
Rhett isn't just another massive YouTuber with doubts. He was a full-time missionary who spent years teaching others how to explain and defend their faith. So when someone with that background says that the resurrection didn't happen, it can be a big deal.
Quite honestly, when Alex was interviewing Rhett, my whole impression is that here we go again. This is like the same old deconstruction story we have heard 1,000 times.
Like myself, Rhett's first step on the road to deconstruction was to discover and become convinced by the truth of evolutionary common ancestry.
Jessie, my wife, who did come from a young earth creationist background, that's, that's what she was taught growing up. When I came home and I was like, we need to talk about something. And I said, I am thoroughly convinced that evolution is true and that we are related to every other animal. I believe in common ancestry. And I just think that it is not just, I sort of think it's true. It's just my reading has led me to think that if this isn't true, then I actually can't determine what anything that's true. It's so overwhelming. Because I'd read additionally to that. She just starts crying. Because she knew what this represented.
Right.
This was the seismic shift.
I think we can all agree that young earth creationism is goofy.
This issue of evolution played a key role in Rhett's deconstruction.
I don't like the idea of being related to apes. I think they're gross. But I think it's true because the science supports it. But 9 times out of 10, I'm talking to people like this because they have gone through this kind of stuff and they have been told by young earth creationists, evolution is of the devil, it's evil, it's incompatible with the scriptures.
I want us to feel the psychological and social effects that it has when we make the issue of evolution a kind of Christianity versus unbelief issue.
Certain young earth creationists, like apparently Rhett himself at one time, have a distorted understanding of the web of beliefs. They think that right at the center of the web is belief in special young earth creationism. And therefore, if that's given up, it has enormous repercussions throughout the web of belief.
Don't let this kind of stuff deconstruct you. Just because these apologists who were not experts in evolutionary biology got evolution wrong, that doesn't mean they're wrong on everything.
This isn't a careful listening. Rhett himself wasn't a committed young earth creationist.
I wasn't a staunch young earth creationist. I didn't think about that issue in particular.
Sure. And Rhett is well aware that many have found ways to harmonize common ancestry with Christianity.
But I picked up a book from an astronomer, Hugh Ross. He has a Christian ministry that is very anti-evolution, but very pro old universe. And I was like, well, I think C.S. Lewis believed in evolution. You start saying these things but there's a lot of Christians who are theistic evolutionists. And okay, so maybe there's something to this. So I read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. And I think a lot of people that I tell this story to are like, what do you mean? But there's all these Christians that believe in evolution. I can't believe that this was so significant for you.
A point that not all the respondents noticed.
This is a completely categorical error. You're conflating a system of biology and a theory on how the universe came to be with whether or not the scriptures are reliable.
So he's saying that evolution, smart Christians will point out how there's no incompatibility with evolution.
He's still talking about it as if there are no good answers or no good views on the compatibility of Christianity and evolution. I never heard one thing that pointed in a direction that he knows about those arguments and those views.
There's guys like Francis Collins, there's guys like Mike Jones from Inspiring Philosophy that holds to a theistic evolution position.
Yeah, and it's I just read Answers in Genesis or a Hugh Ross book, and those sucked. Therefore, Christianity must be false. And it's yeah, I think Answers in Genesis does suck, but that doesn't mean they're the top, the cream of the crop when it comes to answering these questions. But
when you hear an atheist testimony and they're like, so I was confused by this, so I went to my pastor and he couldn't answer me, so I just said, wow, no one's got the answer, and then I left.
This is not a reason to accept or reject Christianity.
It wasn't that Rhett thought that evolution was impossible to reconcile with Christianity. Instead, his experience mirrors mine, and this was the realization that triggered a bigger epiphany.
At that point, I realized how wrong I could be about something so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I never, ever considered that I might be wrong about something so fundamental. And then not only was I wrong, but all of these Christian apologists who were so sure about their critiques of evolution, they had missed the boat so significantly on this that suddenly I was like, can I trust anything else they've got to say about this? So that was the first big domino.
But I do remember, to his fairness, when I mean, because I grew up, Ken Ham was, the fourth person of the Trinity. When I first came to the realization that the earth was probably not 6,000 to 8,000 years old, it was shattering. It threw me off because it made me look at everything very differently, especially not just the Genesis accounts, but God's intentional design. And so, to be fair to him, it is a domino effect.
That's right. Just like Rhett, the truth of evolution made me reevaluate not just my worldview, but more importantly, my epistemology. So much of my Christian faith had been accepting things I was taught based solely on authority. And now the authorities I trusted were wrong about something.
And then when they find out evolution is true, they feel betrayed by you. And then people like Fan and myself have to come in and pick up the pieces and try to help them reconstruct something that is actually meaningful here.
There is real damage that happens when Christians speak with arrogance and unwarranted confidence outside of their expertise, and they just repeat something that maybe they haven't studied.
It's very weird for Rhett to say things like, well, they got this evolution thing wrong.
Yeah.
How can I trust them on anything?
That's not weird. He didn't say they couldn't be trusted on anything. He seems to be expressing the very sane sentiment that maybe he shouldn't be blindly accepting claims based on perceived authority, because people can be wrong. A sentiment you don't actually object to.
Don't believe your favorite apologist on everything. I tell people to fact check me all the time.
To be fair to Rhett, really quickly there too, I take what he just said there to be a recounting of his experience right now.
Right.
Not him saying like they're just wrong about everything. Like that's not his argument.
Well, to be fair to Rhett, he doesn't say like the dominoes just fell from that. He said he looked at other topics and then he kept deconstructing.
Exactly. Like Rhett, this epiphany itself wasn't what caused me to leave Christianity, but instead it set me on a journey of trying to rebuild my Christian faith from the ground up without assuming as my starting point that it was true. Now, Christianity has a very low barrier to entry. John 3:16 says that whoever believes in Jesus shall have eternal life. Romans 10:9 and Acts 16:31 affirm this. The simple belief that Jesus is Lord is enough to be saved. Luke 18:17 says, the kingdom of God must be entered by receiving it like a child. 1 Corinthians 1 says salvation came from the foolishness of what was preached. You can get in with sheer credulity, but for some reason, leaving Christianity is more difficult than canceling your cell phone plan. You can get in with an affirming thought, but to leave, there's a massive reading list. There is a mandatory exit interview, and the pressure is beyond any timeshare sales pitch ever devised.
This just seems like the same deconstruction story we've heard 1,000 times.
Yeah.
I was searching and I came across these issues from Bart Ehrman or evolutionary biologists, and I didn't read Mike Lacona. I didn't read Craig Blomberg. I didn't find Daryl Bach or a Dan Wallace.
I've read all those.
Check out Gary Habermas's work on the resurrection. William Lane Craig, we were just talking about him as well.
I have whole playlists responding to those guys.
People deconstruct, and it just seems like they just start reading all like the liberal side, or like the critical side, and read that stuff. But also, read Luke Vandewey's book that just came out, Living Footnotes on the Gospel of Luke.
I've not yet read that, but to be fair, it just came out, and my read list is long.
It just feels like a lot of these deconstructionists deconstruct with only hearing one side of the aisle. And that's kind of what I got a lot from Rhett.
Maybe when Christianity finally decides which of its thousands of different denominations, each claiming the others are heretics, is the real Christianity, then it could put together a nice reading list of every book a person needs to have read and passed an oral exam about in order to be justified to the apologists that they can leave their faith.
Now, I know that these individuals would fight back on us and say, no, that's not true. We searched high and low, but every time they go to punch against Christianity and they're walking away, it's those figures. So if your issue was truly with a Richard Bauckham or somebody like N.T. Wright,
I read both of those. I even have videos about both.
Then why is it always these fringe fundamentalists, overly conservative, Ken Ham figures, and it's the ones that you're always talking about as to why you weren't satisfied with Christianity?
I mean, you already said it earlier.
Ken Ham was, the fourth person of the Trinity.
When it comes to Ken Ham's answers in Genesis, it is by far and away the Christian Apologetics organization with the largest revenue, earning around $40 million a year. The other big ones are also young Earth creation based. Institute for Creation Research, around 12 million. The smattering of other organizations you've heard of, like Veritas Forums, Stand to Reason, Cross-Examined, Reasonable Faith, those are all just single-digit millions. Ken Ham has reach. Ken Ham has influence. When I was on my journey, I asked fellow Christians who was the best. They all said Ken Ham. I'm not in charge of which Christians are influential. Maybe Christians should idolize better people. That's not for me to determine. Do better, Christians.
It was like pop-level apologists versus critical scholars.
Exactly. And that's kind of what's frustrating about it all.
I don't think Lee Strobel or J. Warner Wallace or Frank Turek are any good either. But it makes the most sense to cover the arguments of the influential as determined by audience size. Just like all 12 of you apologists decided you need to cover Alex and Rhett, even though you clearly don't respect his arguments. You do it because they're influencing millions of subscribers.
I feel like there's too much straw manning when there's a deconstruction where they find the most conservative, most fundamentalist kind of approach to Christian answers for the hard questions. And because they don't get them there, then that defines the rest of Christianity or how we believe.
When I was a Christian, I did the common Christian thing and insisted that my flavor of Christianity was the only right flavor.
In my estimation, Catholics weren't Christians. I mean, I was that type of evangelical.
Whoa,
yeah.
Really?
But as you suggest, Michael, I started reading different Christian perspectives and realized that there are 45,000 denominations. I could never realistically investigate them all, let alone dream of having the hubris to decide and declare which was the right one.
So you have to have some humility. You have to have this idea that maybe God is working through other churches.
But what I could do was go straight to the heart of it. I could study the single, only, universal Christian falsification criteria as given to us by the Apostle Paul himself.
1 Corinthians 15, verse 17 says, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied."
At the core of Christianity is one central claim, that Jesus died and rose again from the dead for our sins. And if that didn't happen, then Christianity is false.
I wouldn't need to worry about selecting between evolution harmonizations if I could just prove to myself that Jesus rose from the dead.
The earth could be 6,000 years old and Jesus could still be dead and Christianity be false. And, you know, we could descend from monkeys and Jesus could rise from the dead and Christianity could be true.
My first domino may have been related to evolution, but my last domino was the resurrection. That's a shorter reading list. Not short by any means, but shorter.
This is where, after they talked through evolution, they talk about Jesus and the resurrection.
Because I was like, well, I'm not going to stop believing in Jesus. You can have these weird ideas about the Old Testament, but Jesus is different. I mean, I have a personal relationship with him and, and that stuff's true, right? The stuff about the resurrection, my arguments for why the resurrection had happened and it being the best explanation for the beginning of the church and all this. I had those arguments in my back pocket. They're a little bit different because I do think that there is a more interesting conversation around the resurrection because you can kind of know a little bit less about what happened. And you can be somebody who believes all this stuff about that I might agree with related to evolution, but then be like, I have a faith position that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I recognize that it's not a scientific thing. I can't prove it. It is a little bit different category. But it opened me up to questioning these sacred ideas. And it's just the most sacred idea of all that Jesus was the Son of God who raised from the dead, eventually was the last domino to fall.
Before we get to thoughts about the resurrection, I need to point out and establish that at no point are any of the panelists going to be treating those thoughts with even a moment of actual due consideration. You see, Rhett was actually careful to say, best explanation for the beginning of the church. And some of those explanations will posit that the Gospels contain false claims. In fact, it's completely impossible to posit a naturalistic explanation that doesn't contradict the Gospels, because the Gospels explicitly claim a supernatural event. Judging a naturalistic hypothesis for Christian origins by how closely it affirms the Gospels is like judging a bachelor on how much you like his wife. Every respondent is starting with gospel reliability and is evaluating Rhett against gospel reliability.
They said they saw Jesus, talked with him, ate with them, touched his wounds. And if that testimony is true, that's not just a claim, it's a direct confirmation of Christianity's central truth.
Yes. If OJ's testimony was true, he was innocent of murder. If Robert Gimlin's testimony is true, there's a Bigfoot creature in California. If Whitley Strieber's testimony is true, aliens are abducting people. This isn't meaningful analysis.
And so, like, I treat the New Testament documents the same way I treat any other ancient documents. And I try to say, okay, are they reliable? The same way I would judge any ancient document being reliable. And when I feel like I do that, we come to a conclusion that, yes, they are very reliable. And then therefore we can trust a lot of the information in them. And then we can make a good resurrection argument.
I too treat the New Testament documents the same way I treat other ancient documents, on a claim-by-claim basis, and being particularly skeptical of these supernatural claims, no matter how much verifiable information surrounds it. I'm consistent to say that the Egyptian Book of the Dead provides insights into Egyptian practices and ideology, while simultaneously rejecting as ahistorical the spells, gods, and magic it reports. I'm consistent to say that the Annals of Tacitus is a good source for Roman emperors and possibly Christians, while rejecting Vespasian actually healing a blind man. I'm consistent to say that Josephus may be right about first-century Jewish-Roman affairs, while rejecting his divine portents and miracles. I could go on and on. Actual history is not done by putting documents into binary categories of entirely reliable and entirely unreliable, with unquestioned allegiance or wholesale rejection. This is a religious methodology, not a historical one.
If Matthew already has a strong track record, accurate names, locations, customs, and political details, then when he does finally say something that's really weird, the right response isn't to automatically dismiss him. We ought to pause and say, okay, well, Matthew's pretty reliable, so maybe this did happen.
There's no transitive property for truth. A claim doesn't become true by being adjacent to true details. The most effective lies are largely true, and people are mistaken all the time. I cannot fathom having this level of credulity.
And really the reason why you would believe in something like this is, at least in my view, is because you've already got this other evidence for the resurrection, for Jesus establishing a church, for establishing, the canon of Scripture, and then you believe everything that is in Scripture, and so therefore you believe something like this. Like that's the sort of chain of reasoning that would lead me to believe that something like this happened.
In the past, I've tried to reserve, for the Bible tells me so, specifically for times when our only source of a claim is within one of the 66 or so, depending on your denomination, documents that make up the Christian Bible collection. But I think Cameron and all the respondents have basically given me permission to use it more broadly in this video. Their justification is that they feel the Bible has been authenticated enough that we should believe all of it. Apparently, mundane affirmation warrants swallowing supernatural claims without need of corroboration for those, i.e., they cannot even entertain what Rhett and Alex are talking about because of an a priori commitment to...
The idea there is AP's thinking along the lines of, I've accepted Christianity as the way, and therefore I believe in what Christianity teaches, and therefore if Christianity teaches the resurrection, I believe in the resurrection.
Which is why I'm asking how much the proving the reality of it matters to other people, because to me the discussion is already closed. I believe in it. That's it.
To be clear, they are not doing critique or analysis. They are merely pointing out Rhett doesn't believe every detail of the gospel narratives, lending no more insight than a child playing spot the differences in these two pictures game.
And I just doubt that he's probably very familiar with more of like a maximal case, and like a strong argument for the reliability of the Gospels, outside of like popular level apologetics books that he might have read.
When an apologist says maximal case for the resurrection, what they mean is that secondary literature has affirmed for them that it's okay for them to simply believe the non-mundane claims in the primary literature because they're adjacent to mundane claims, which is just with extra steps. Rhett said it best.
I have sort of lost my ability to have faith in things that are just conjecture.
All right, let's dig into resurrection.
There's that. And then there's the resurrection. That's not just like a vibe shift. This is the historical claim upon which Christianity is based. And like you say, it's less accessible to the scientific method.
He said it's based. Cut that. He said Christianity is based. Put that on the soundboard. Alex O'Connor, Christianity is based.
Let me try one more time, guys. This is important that we
don't mess this up.
This is
we want to hear Alex O'Connor say Christianity is based.
The historical claim upon which Christianity is based. And like you
I like the little pause there.
That's so perfect. It's so perfect the way you said it.
Is based.
No. Hey, this would actually be funny. That'd be a funny little tweet. Alex O'Connor admits Christianity is based, and that's just a clip. That'll be up later tonight.
Or just a quote. Yeah, just a quote. Christianity is based / Alex O'Connor.
Well, good for you guys.
Probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective.
All right. Rhett has made the incredibly modest claim that the historical account is sufficiently explained by any who did die in the name of Christianity, having done so being sincerely mistaken. That is, Rhett sees no reason to assert that any murders were lying. That should be clear to everyone, right?
So if his argument is they believe the lie intentionally, my question would be, how many people would intentionally believe a lie that would harm their quality of life and allow them to die a brutal death?
Okay, that's exactly the opposite. Did everyone but Ruslan understand?
Okay, so Rhett's suggestion is that the disciples weren't lying, they were just deceived. Or in other words, maybe they were just sincerely wrong about seeing the risen Jesus.
Good.
So Rhett seems to start with the assumption that the resurrection appearances are like some vague spiritual experience, something the disciples just misinterpreted in their grief. Maybe it was a hallucination, maybe it was mass hysteria, but there is no need for a miracle, just a mistake.
Close enough. And is everyone ready to complain that this would contradict the Bible?
They didn't just claim to see him once in passing. They spent several more days talking with them, walking with them, and eating with them. Thomas even touched the holes on Jesus' wrist. So this is not some sort of mild religious impression. It's physical, relational, and hands-on experience.
We're not talking about a handful of emotional people seeing a shadow or a figure in the clouds and just running with it. The disciples claimed, at least, that they had extended conversations with Jesus in groups, that they touched him, that he ate with them, and on multiple occasions. They said that they spent 6 weeks with him after rising, and then he physically ascended into heaven, distinguishing those meetings from later spiritual experiences. That's not religious hysteria, that's detailed multi-sensory interaction over time across multiple locations.
Yes, the Gospels say these things happened. But a skeptic isn't in the business of accepting all claims at face value. In fact, any of these tactile elements occur only in the later written Gospels, not the first, and seem expressly written to refute anyone who might have been perpetuating a notion that Jesus rose only spiritually. If you're just going to accept this uncritically, there's room for that. But the escalations are interesting when you allow yourself to look dispassionately.
Were the disciples deceivers? Or were they deceived? Now, if they weren't deceivers, then what hypothesis would appeal to their being sincerely mistaken about Jesus' resurrection? Well, it's pretty hard to think of one, Sean.
So what's the skeptic's best move? It's to claim that these stories were just all made up later and that the disciples never actually claimed any of that. But now you're not just doubting a miracle, you're doubting the entire character of the gospel authors. What you're saying is that they crafted intricate fictions about group meals, physical contact, and lengthy conversation, and passed them off as real.
They would have to be like, oh, well, he never rose, but I'm going to write it down anyways. And he didn't appear to 500, but I'm going to write it down anyways. And all these things didn't happen, but I'm going to write it anyways.
I don't have to impugn bad motive to the New Testament authors. Not a single one of them even claims to be a first-hand eyewitness. Each was likely fully convinced of the resurrection based on the testimony of others. And they were either adopting evolving polemics from within the community, as subsequent tellers would iterate on the Jesus story, or they were willing to be hyperbolic with literary and theological flourishes to strengthen the story against historical or theological objections, or some of each.
The gospel authors show every sign of being careful and honest.
Strong disagree, but careful and honest people are deceived all the time. This is not a fanciful take. Uncritically accepting every word of an ancient document is the fanciful take.
And so all of them would be deceived for something that there was no precedent for, and then that would cause them to die, be okay with dying these brutal deaths?
Yes, that is how deception works. A deceived person behaves identically to a correct person. Motivation is affected only by confidence, not by truth.
That's the famous argument that Christian apologists use, right? Why would
I've used that. I've used that. Matter of fact, I just did like an hour-long video with Sean McDowell on that, since he literally wrote the book on the fates of the apostles.
That's true, David. And the two of you landed at the same point Rhett just made.
What should people conclude from your research on this issue?
This is a great final question. The way this is often phrased, and sadly I phrased it myself somewhat this way in my early days. Wish I had a recording of that actually now. I would play it and embarrass myself. Something to the effect of, the apostles were all, they died as martyrs except for John. They believe the resurrection happened. It's true, therefore Christianity is true. That just simply is a non sequitur. We cannot conclude that Christianity is true or the resurrection happened from this. So this is one piece, and I think an important piece, that they're not liars.
That's all Rhett said. Historical martyrs seem explainable as sincerely mistaken. How many of the 12 is that again, Sean?
So of the 12, I think only 2 are in the highest level of historical probability or close to it.
Just 2? Or is it really just 1 and something close to it?
Let's go with James, the son of Zebedee. We have this account in Acts 12. It's one of the only 2 accounts of their deaths we have in the scriptures. Peter, John 21, James, Acts 12:2. Well, a lot of this relies upon the historicity of the book of Acts, which is beyond what we can go into now, but I think there's a strong case for it historically. So I had him originally at highest possible probability, put him down 1 since we only have 1 source for it.
Right, so the evidence for James, son of Zebedee is... which leaves just Peter. Remember that Paul and Jesus' brother James are later converts, not part of the 12.
So it wasn't like folks didn't recant their faith. Like, there were folks that, when faced with terrible deaths,
if historical records are correct, and Peter died at the order of Emperor Nero, who was falsely blaming Christians for a fire at the time, then Nero didn't care one little bit about Peter's ideology. Peter wouldn't have been given an opportunity to recant because he was being used as a literal scapegoat. The more you look at this, the more it falls apart. There simply isn't even strong evidence that more than 2 of the 12 were even members of Christianity after Jesus' death, let alone preaching, other than... Sadly and inexplicably, subject matter expert Sean McDowell didn't even weigh in on this in his own reaction video, but instead let the point be conceded for the sake of argument.
The problem is, even if the disciples were deceived, you still have the conversion of James, you still have the conversion of Paul, and the evidence for the empty tomb that are all going to require some explanation.
If you accept that Peter was deceived and then convinced others, and sadly we don't have time to unpack that whole thing in this video, it's pretty easy to include James in the list of those who became convinced by Peter. In Paul's letters, he's pretty open that his experience was a visionary one. So you can explain the origins of Christianity with a sincerely mistaken Peter and a sincerely mistaken Paul, as someone has been out here saying for years. In short, to account for the established history of Christianity, we need only a single disciple to claim Jesus rose, a later convert who hallucinated the same, and an urban legend to spread As for empty tomb,
what I've learned about the process of historical investigation and also just the nature of human psychology and the nature of religious movements and the nature of people's willingness to believe things, like, it began to dawn on me that I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know the nature of specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into a large, like mass grave? Was he put into a rich man's grave by Joseph of Arimathea? Was that invented? I don't know.
I was really surprised here that Rhett would call into question what happened to the body of Jesus. The evidence that the vast majority of New Testament historians find corpse was in fact interred in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea.
This should be of no surprise whatsoever, and Craig's appeal to majority is overplayed unless he's limiting New Testament scholars to only those who are evangelical Christians. Neither the burial of Jesus nor an empty tomb narrative make it into Gary Habermas's list of minimal facts that are widely accepted by scholars. He writes, the second criterion of the amount of scholarly support is where the empty tomb lags behind. Scholars like Dale B. Martin, John Dominic Crossan, Bart Ehrman, Gerd Ludemann, and Paula Fredrickson have all published against the Joseph of Arimathea story. And while apologists like to point to archaeologist Jody Magnus as affirming the plausibility of the story, Jody has been on this channel explaining that just because the story is compatible with archaeology, that's not the same as being historical.
Look, so I just want to clarify, when I say they're consistent with, they are consistent with. Does that prove the historicity of the gospel accounts? It doesn't prove that the accounts are historical, but it means that whoever wrote those accounts was familiar with how the Jews of Jerusalem disposed of their dead in the time of Jesus.
Rhett didn't say he knew what happened to Jesus' body. He just expressed that there's reason for doubt.
But what seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead.
This was an honest admission by Rhett. It's similar to Bart Ehrman's position, that while he does have his own notion of what might have happened, the evidence is so underdeterminate that a myriad of naturalistic explanations remain plausible and viable options with not enough concrete data to actually prefer one over the other. That's not a weakness. If there's a forest fire with no obvious evidence as to the cause, authorities are justified and honest in saying, we don't yet know what started the fire, but we're almost certain it wasn't dragons. But Christians aren't comfortable with uncertainty.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
So they predictably had to pounce on Rhett.
And yet here he says he is almost certain that Jesus did not rise. Now that betokens an incredible lack of curiosity on Rhett's part. Virtually all skeptical scholars today say that they have no idea how this movement got started. There is no naturalistic explanation that is accepted by a significant number of scholars. And so I wonder, where does Rhett's confidence that it didn't happen come from?
You just can't say, well, there's probably a naturalistic explanation that can account for all this, and then go, well, it's probably out there somewhere, and then get mad at Christians for having faith. You clearly have faith in something that you don't know exists.
All he's given is an unsupported guess, and that's fine if he wants to guess, but he can't say that Christians don't rely on the evidence while not relying on the evidence himself.
You're just as bad as me arguments are amusing. You're saying a dragon started the forest fire, and Rhett is saying, I don't have enough information to pinpoint the exact cause of the fire, but it probably wasn't a dragon. That's not a faith position. That's just a rejection of the dragon claim until such time as fire-breathing dragons have been demonstrated.
He throws out the mistaken option, but I mean, I guess he's just having to assume that the Gospels are garbage and that everything that is described in the Gospels.
Nuanced positions exist between the Gospels are garbage and this apologist's everything in the Gospels is true take.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Rhett seems open to the Gospels having kernels of historicity intermixed with some ahistorical claims.
all the multisensory stuff, them eating with Jesus, being invited to touch his wounds and all this other kind of stuff. That must just be like late legendary development.
Or early legendary development, depending how you define it. But yes, exactly.
And I would probably push back on that and say you need to maybe take more whole document reliability kind of thing, more holistic kind of thing.
Hard to disagree. It literally happened exactly as described, or it's all garbage, may well be the worst possible way to approach ancient documents.
I think that these reports go back to eyewitnesses. So that makes it nearly impossible for them to be mistaken.
I mean, of course you do. You're advocating a maximalist case. And I think the case for the Gospels being eyewitness reports is thin and unconvincing, which you can learn more about in my Who Really Wrote the Gospels video. Most of this panel has actually responded to that one as well, which I would characterize as mainly making excuses to hold on to preconceptions, but you should look at it for yourself so that you've heard both sides.
I mean, like, read Nick Meter's book, Resurrection, Extraordinary Evidence for an Extraordinary Claim. When you start going through that data, it gets very, very hard to say that.
Okay. At the risk of sounding like I'm just slinging dismissive comments back at dismissive comments, I recently read Nick Meter's Resurrection book. I read a lot of resurrection books. I try to read them all, and this is undoubtedly in my bottom 3 in terms of quality. I want to say it's the worst of all time, but that's probably just my recency bias. I'm planning to do an in-depth coverage video on it at some point this summer, but by all means, go read it. It won't take you long, and then jump in the comments and tell me why I'm wrong about it.
We were talking last night about Dale Allison, how I just think I love his book.
He's great.
And this was all like, I read that like 2 years ago. So this is all way after my deconstruction, but I'm still interested in the subject. But, he's a Christian. He believes that it happened. But I think he's got one of the best books on the resurrection.
Agree. Meter's might be the worst, but Allison's is the best, even though I completely disagree with his conclusion that Jesus rose. And that's not just because he came on my channel and gave me an A. What kind of grade would you give me on this?
Yeah, you get an A.
The thing is so refreshing about it is he's not coming at this from like a Gary Habermas standpoint where he's like, this is the most reasonable thing. And if you don't agree with that, you're being unreasonable.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I'm not a Habermas fan at all, and I think his most recent book was terrible.
All right, we got a Resurrection book club going here. Split decision on Meter, 2 thumbs up for Allison, and 2 big thumbs down for Habermas.
But just bringing up Habermas, his approach, going back to I think in his original doctoral dissertation, he listed 10 facts, and he said, these are the facts that are agreed upon generally by scholars across the board. And therefore, if you want to explain the resurrection, your theory has to account for all these things. Then later he expanded it to 12 facts. And so taking facts that you can actually defend and that scholars believe, whether they're Christians or atheists or whatever, and saying, okay, if you want a good explanation for the evidence, it has to account for these things. And guess what? Your alternative theories, they just don't.
Sorry, David, but you're several decades behind on your Gary Habermas lore. 2 volumes of his 4-part, 4,000-page magnum opus are out, and his final minimal facts list is officially down to just 6 facts that scholars will agree upon. And my minimal witness hypothesis quite handily covers all of them, as do the suggestions of a litany of other skeptics. This is precisely why IP's panel doesn't like the minimal facts approach.
He does have a point. Like, we need more evidence to bring in besides just like Paul in 1 Corinthians 15.
Thank you. I do have a point.
What are you going to do with Allison? I like how he switches over to Habermas, but he doesn't actually answer the objectives of Allison.
I'll push back on this slightly and to be the annoying maximalist. And I think Allison and Habermas will agree on the same set of facts.
Of course.
And Allison will say that the skeptic is rational and that Gary is also rational.
Yeah.
They're both rational for their rejection.
Indeed. Allison writes, one who disbelieves in miracles can, with good conscience, remain disbelieving in the literal resurrection of Jesus after an examination of the evidence, just as a traditional Christian can retain belief after surveying the pertinent particulars. No doubt both things have happened. One can hardly fault the judgment that the evidence really is inconclusive, and also pure historical reasoning is not going to show us that God raised Jesus from the dead. That conviction is rather a postulate of what one might call practical Christian reasoning.
I don't think you can say that if you put in a maximalist case.
Allison knows what's up. He writes, every alternative history will, in other words, necessarily be speculative and indeed oppose the text at important points. Given how little we know, this is not the fatal flaw some imagine it to be.
And I think Dale actually is probably more right in saying, like, well, unless we know what the appearances were like,
yeah,
I get why a skeptic would think that, you know, maybe this isn't a rational belief. And so at the end of the day, like, Dale would probably say, like, yeah, it is kind of a faith thing.
How dare Rhett put forth the same conclusion as the respected Christian scholar and author of the best resurrection book?
That's my frustration with Rhett here.
Yeah.
What are you going to do with Allison's argument? Okay, you don't like Habermas's and you don't like these others. If you trust Allison and you like the way he handles things, then hear him out to the fullest, and you need to have a full explanation against him, not just naturally that doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Well said.
Rhett or I can disagree with some things Allison says and agree with other things he says, right? Is this still part of your it's all true or it's all garbage view that you seem to have with the Bible?
Oh, yeah, I love Dale Allison. I think he's great. I love reading his stuff, and I think he makes a lot of good points. I just don't agree with everything he says.
Oh, so you do get it. Great.
I'm pretty sure that there is a development as the Gospels go on about the description of the tomb. So like in Mark's Gospel, presumably, I think it just says that Jesus is put in a tomb. And in Matthew's Gospel, it becomes a new tomb. And then I think by Luke, it's a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Or maybe that's John. I can't remember the details, but there's things that you wouldn't notice that I'd never come across this idea before. If the empty tomb is an important apologetic to Jesus' resurrection, well, we know that the tomb was empty. In order to know that the tomb was empty, you need to ensure that Jesus was probably the only person laid in it, because otherwise it could have been mixed up with someone else or something like this. And so there is this hint at evidence of an early apologetical motive to make the tomb a new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in there, and then specifically a new tomb in which no one had been laid.
Right.
So that when they say there's an empty tomb, nobody can come along and say, well, are you sure it wasn't somebody else, or someone stole the body, or it got lost or something? No, it has to be an empty tomb.
Alex's gradual development theory sounds pretty devastating until you actually look at the text. If the gospel writers were really collabing to craft a myth, you would expect a much smoother narrative buildup, each detail reinforcing the last, escalating the grandeur. But that's not at all what we see.
Except Alex isn't at all positing collaboration. The authors of Matthew and Luke were obviously trying to improve upon Mark, because they thought Mark was deficient. Scrolls and ink were expensive. So if they're just trying to do expansion packs, they wouldn't bother recopying Mark. They were writing Mark 2.0 or Mark 3.0, trying to fix the problems in the previous versions. And when it comes to the burial narrative, the problems were plot holes.
The same thing goes with Joseph of Arimathea. Mark says that he took courage to ask Pilate for the body, but why would he need courage? Mark doesn't explain. John fills in the gap. Joseph was a secret disciple who had been afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Mark's comment makes sense. Joseph took courage because he had reason to be afraid. But what does John do? He drops the praise entirely. If John were just copying and upgrading Mark, you'd expect him to amplify Joseph's bravery, not undermine it. Instead, John highlights that Joseph had been a secret disciple for fear of the Jews. That's not at all heroic progression. That's actually a demotion. What's interesting is that earlier in the same gospel, John explicitly throws shade on people who believe in him but kept quiet out of fear. John 12:43 says, "They love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God." Meanwhile, Mark calls him brave. Luke calls him righteous and even goes out of his way to tell us that Joseph had not consented to their decision and action regarding Jesus' death. This isn't literary development. It's honest, independent reporting where two different writers give you the same character from opposite angles.
In the decades before any of the New Testament books were written down, as some Jesus movement evangelists began to advocate for physical resurrection, they would have needed to answer basic questions. Why didn't the Romans leave the body like they usually do? Or why didn't the family take the body? Why didn't the Sanhedrin put Jesus in the ground in the criminal's graveyard, like the bodies of the thieves allegedly crucified beside him would have been handled? This obvious problem necessitated the invention of someone to intervene from what everyone knew would normally happen. Someone powerful enough to have ready access to Pilate after work hours on a holiday, while simultaneously having motive to do so. And so the first written Gospel of Mark introduces Joseph of Arimathea, described simply as a prominent member of the council who was waiting for the kingdom of God. But in the years after Mark's circulation, people started noticing that Mark also says the council all condemned him as worthy of death. If Joseph was a prominent member of the council, then he voted to put Jesus to death in the morning, and then by the evening considered him to be Messiah. So in Matthew's revision, the author fixed this plot hole by removing Joseph from the council and reinventing him as just a rich man and a disciple of Jesus. This kept plausible both means and motive to get the body without Mark's council problems. But the author of Luke didn't get the same memo because he kept Joseph on the council, but still tried to fix the plot hole by insisting he was a good and upright man who had not consented to the decision and action. As is often the case, Matthew and Luke fix Mark problems, but in different ways. In the intervening years as these Gospels spread, readers likely had trouble reconciling how a member of the Sanhedrin, Mark and Luke, could simultaneously be a disciple of Jesus as in Matthew, prompting the author of John to offer a new detail. Joseph of Arimathea was a disciple secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. Eric wants to say these are undesigned coincidences, but from an outsider perspective, these changes look incredibly designed and like patches to fix story problems. If I may quote Christian scholar Dale Allison one more time, the narratives of Jesus' burial, set side by side, strongly suggest a proclivity toward the legendary.
It's not clear that these differences in the later Gospels are due to apologetic motifs. Ask yourself, how would it help to say that it was a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid? What would that refute? He must be thinking that there's some detractor or opponent of the disciples who said, you confused the remains of Jesus with the remains of someone else, that you thought he was risen from the dead, but in fact he wasn't. But there was never any dispute over the identification of Jesus' remains. A man who had been crucified 3 days earlier would be easy to identify. So I don't see that these differences are motivated by apologetical considerations.
How the turntables have turned, Bill, as I'm now the one wondering how much reading you are doing on this topic, as at least 3 prominent scholars have written about tomb elaborations as evolving polemics. Raymond Brown, Maurice Casey, and the aforementioned Dale Allison. They all agree the earliest account from Mark is preserving a simple oral tradition that rescues Jesus' body from being eaten by animals, tossed in mass grave, or forgotten in the criminal's graveyard. But Jewish stone-cut tombs were almost always used by many bodies, whole families, something readers of Mark probably wondered about when the tomb was found empty, since most such tombs had bodies in them already. So Matthew plugged up that ambiguity/plot hole by giving it that label, new tomb. Scholars think this detail also fought against defenses that Jesus' body might have been confused with another corpse, or that the women went to the wrong tomb, since a new tomb would have been more distinctive. Brown thinks this detail also solidified a theological connection with King David, who is also said to have been placed in a new empty tomb. The author of Luke, adding the no one had ever been laid there detail, is the most important polemic of them all. The Jewish social taboo against mingling dishonorable burials with honorable ones. Wealthy families could potentially reclaim criminal bodies, but they would still defile any corpses already present. And no member of the Sanhedrin would do such a thing, even for Jesus. This is a potential problem in Mark, but the plot hole is plugged by explicitly saying no one had ever been laid there. Jody Magnus, Craig Evans, and Brian McCain have also written on this aspect. The author of John adding that the tomb was nearby may have been to help make more plausible the seemingly impossible timeline of events needed to get Jesus' body taken care of by sundown. And Casey and Brown suspect John's garden detail is a symbolic element to the Garden of Eden and Paradise Restored. None of these are my ideas. These are New Testament scholars. Bill?
Even if there was an apologetic angle here, it wouldn't necessarily undermine its historicity. I mean, the end of John says Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But they're written so you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. John puts his cards on the table.
Yeah.
But of course, that's why he points towards miracles. That's why we can assess the eyewitnesses. And so if there's a bias, we still have to ask the question, what does that bias cause? Blindness? Belief in the truth? Does that affect the way they report the facts? I don't think it even follows that it's unreliable if there's an apologetic angle at all. Yeah,
you are absolutely right about that. At most, an apologetic interest would tell us why the author included the detail, but it does absolutely nothing to prove that the detail is therefore non-historical. It would just talk to us or tell us something about the author's motivations. So even given that these motifs were apologetical in nature, you're quite right that all this speaks to is the motivation of the author, and it says nothing about the facticity of the details related.
I'm excited to have McDowell and Craig acknowledge the apologetic motive, and I agree. While it doesn't prove that they invented or exaggerated details, it does tell us that if there ever was a hypothetical tension between history and theology, they were going to choose theology. The purpose of these documents was first and foremost to recruit new followers to Christianity. One can't unsee that.
Those little questions. Are we sure that he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb in the way that it's described? And if you start to notice apologetical motivations, potentially, in those very stories, it starts to undermine the historicity a little bit.
This is why, like, when I talked to Alex on the Jubilee thing, I specifically started off with talking about the historical reportage model.
Roll the clip.
If I were to give you a model of the Gospels that I would call like the historical reportage model, they rooted their historical work in eyewitness testimony and did not feel the freedom to make up historical facts. If we were to get there, would that be enough for you to say the probability that the resurrection happened relative to any other countering theory is higher?
No, I don't think so. The authors of the Gospels, specifically on the resurrection, can't be trusted to be giving an accurate account of what happened.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking if we had this historical reportage model, and that was true.
Sure, well, if it were true that they were reporting historical events, then it would be a historical event, yeah.
There you go. Your historical reportage model framing is a tautology, and as such is argumentatively worthless. It's
with extra steps. Why are they not doing this apologetic aspect with what the disciples said? Yeah. I mean, like, now we got to invent another explanation for why the gospel authors wrote about them this way. Well, they wanted the disciples to be a certain way to sort of present this message as like, you know, the people that are going to believe are going to be the least likely, that kind of thing. But, okay, so now we're multiplying assumptions beyond necessity, making it far more ad hoc.
Observing that the non-eyewitness authors of the Gospels care more about making theological points than preserving accurate history isn't multiplying assumptions. It's all the same assumption and fits the literature far better than the completely ad hoc historical reportage model that Fan is selling.
What is the simplest, the most parsimonious explanation?
Obviously, the simplest explanation is just to say, trust me, bro, and believe everything in the Bible. And then it's all just true, with no moving parts. Everything happened just like it said. So easy. When you skeptics don't believe parts of it, you're making it more complicated. So by definition, Mike wins, because his view is uncomplicated. See how that works? Easy. Or, and hear me out, does each supernatural claim multiply entities beyond what is necessary? Because the non-supernatural explanations are fully sufficient. And we can all agree that the natural world exists, and we cannot definitively say the supernatural world exists. So Occam's razor obviously favors any natural explanation. Something to think about. Boy, do I sound Canadian.
Like how Matthew's gospel is the only one that mentions the guards at the tomb.
Right.
And we're told why the guards, like we're told by Matthew essentially why he's included the story of the guards, because they are like, Jesus is gone, and the Jews pay the guards and say, you're going to spread the rumor that the body got stolen. That's what you're going to do. And the guards are like, sure thing, we'll do that. We'll take that money. And this is a rumor that still persists to this day, says Matthew's gospel.
And what's the best explanation for that?
Is it like there were actually guards and Matthew is the only person who happened to report them? Or has Matthew invented the guards as an apologetical tool?
This guard at the tomb thing from Alex is another classic argument from silence.
It's not an argument from silence to point out that we have only a single source for something. Just as multiple independent attestation can increase confidence in a claim, single attestation lowers confidence. Doesn't prove anything, but it is a tried and true historical guideline.
When critics point out that Mark, Luke, and John don't mention the guard of the tomb, that doesn't prove much of anything. It just proves that they didn't mention it. That's it. If Matthew is just making this up as an apologetic, you would actually expect the story to get picked up and expanded by the others.
Interesting, Eric. Are you admitting that the authors of Luke and John had copies of the Gospel of Matthew to reference? Interesting. That would mean none of the Gospels are independent attestation to anything. As Alex says,
maybe there were gods. Like, we can't prove that there weren't. But when you start to see how much potential apologetical motivation is underlying these claims in these Gospels, which, although broadly seeming to be attempts at historical biography, are also just full of what is probably best thought of as mythical storytelling, becomes really difficult.
And by the way, in William Lane Craig's resurrection book, The Sun Rises.
The Sun Rises. That is probably one of the top books that I would recommend
classic
to you guys.
Craig himself doesn't rule out that the guards at the tomb story might possibly be an invented polemic.
Dale Allison talks at length about the raising of the graves in Matthew's Gospel at the time of Jesus'
which
death.
is bonkers.
There's the bonkers line. Yeah, he says it's bonkers.
Absolutely bonkers. But it's really strange how it's worded as well, because it says that when Jesus dies, it says at that moment when he dies, there's a great earthquake and all the graves open, and the holy ones of Jerusalem appear to people after the resurrection.
So the idea would be, as far as the argument goes, one, did this happen? And two, if it happened, why didn't other writers mention something like this? And if other people didn't mention this, does it sound like something that's made up? Keep in mind, everyone has a limited amount of space with which to write a document. A scroll in the ancient world, if you want the longest scroll you can actually go and buy, I think it's like something like 30 feet and so on. That's why, by the way, that's why Matthew, Luke, John, and Acts are all about the same length. That's the length of a scroll that you would buy for a document back then. So they all have to choose what they're going to include.
So the reason only Matthew includes this story is because the other books had word count restraints. I mean, someone was able to stick a whole new ending on Mark, insert the entire woman caught in adultery into John, and actually at least one scribe inserted that whole story into Luke. That's one reason we know it's not original to John. It seems like these scrolls had space to record the single greatest miracle ever. Forget just Jesus. This was many people raised from the dead, all at once. Alex doesn't care so much that it's not in the Gospels.
What's at stake there? If this happened, this would be the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in human history. And yet,
and then you're going to make an argument from silence from there.
Some arguments from silence do work. It's not reported in any of the other Gospels.
I understand.
It's not in Josephus. It's not in Acts.
That's one data
It's not
point.
anywhere. Most Christian scholars, I think, so people like Dale Allison, for example, believe that this didn't actually happen.
Two, you can go in the direction like Mike Licona and so on, where he describes this as a kind of language that people use and so on.
Apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic language. He's not actually claiming this happened. This is how you would describe something of tremendous significance or something like that. And then you'll have the idea that that this didn't happen. And so the question there would be, one, as Alex is pointing out, did Matthew think that it happened? Did he actually believe that it happened? Or did he know he was making that up? And if he knew that he was making that up, oopsie, what else is he making up? So those are the main possibilities that are on the table. But here's the thing. If you go with that last one and say, Matthew deliberately made this up. He deliberately made up this story. And they're like, uh-oh, what would that mean? Well, what it would mean is you can't trust material that's unique to Matthew. That's what it would mean. That wouldn't tell you anything about Paul or anyone else. It wouldn't tell you about the creed. It wouldn't tell you about Mark. It wouldn't tell you about material that's in Luke. It wouldn't tell you about that material that's in John. It wouldn't tell you about what the earliest church believed, because keep in mind, Matthew is decades after the events and so on. So would this cause you to reject the resurrection? I'll go ahead and say it here. If I believe that this was 100% an obvious lie by Matthew, I'd still believe in the resurrection, because my belief in the resurrection isn't based on this.
You'd lose the Magi, Peter walking on water, and Sermon on the Mount. But yeah, the resurrection is recorded elsewhere. You would lose the earliest two resurrection appearance narratives, Jesus appearing to the women, and the Great Commission message in Galilee, which is the grounding for evangelism efforts. But the ripple effects to the church would be significant. Cameron would have to be sad, because the office of the Pope would be undermined without Matthew 16:18. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Inerrancy and canon would be destroyed, of course, as would the whole undesigned coincidences endeavor. Because it would show these details are indistinguishable from designed details, or merely reading too much into the text. It would mean that church fathers like Papias, Irenaeus, and Origen, who cited Matthew as a reliable apostolic tradition, would also be wrong, further demonstrating that the church fathers were misled, credulous, or complicit. Papias is also really the only source for the Gospel of Mark being tied to Peter, so that authority would also be in question. Irenaeus propped up the four Gospel canon, orthodoxy, and apostolic succession. It would lower any confidence one might have that early Christians were able to discern truth from fiction.
We're sitting here having this conversation in the context of 2025, where we have access to all this scholarship. And all this scholarship and all these discussions about these issues are such a recent phenomenon that, first of all, the tiny minority of people who live today, who call themselves Christians, care about this stuff and actually take time to think about it, right? You believe that Jesus rose from the dead if you're a Christian, probably because your parents told you. Like 90% because your parents told you. And then you got into a movement where it's continually confirmed by people who come in and they say some smart stuff about it, and this is why you can trust it. So even if it did happen, it doesn't feel like a really penetrating investigation into the historical circumstances is what's going to make it click and be like, oh, it did happen. I looked under the last rock of history and I found the resurrection. Like, it doesn't seem like God intended for that to be the way. If
that's right,
this is clearly some sort of, this is a revelation. This is like, this is a secret. This is like God's secret information that you can choose to believe. And then your life is transformed. Like, I'm okay with people who frame it in that way. I'm like, well, I still think that I think this is a psychological phenomenon. I don't believe it. I'm a skeptic in that regard, but I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it. It's like, do you really think that that's gonna be the thing that changes somebody's mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's what Jesus was doing.
No,
verily I say unto you, premise one.
Yeah, he wasn't doing apologetics.
It doesn't work like that. It's clearly like not what it's all about.
Right.
And apologetics can only take you so far.
Those of us who do apologetics should be the first to acknowledge this. To the extent that we ever give the impression that arguments can get someone to faith, or that arguments completely cement you into certainty or something like this, we're doing a disservice to people. Generally speaking, I think we can and should acknowledge that arguments are not what causes someone to believe. But usually other factors like social, emotional, psychological factors are very part of the process for whatever we choose to believe.
He says it's not as though people come to faith through historical investigation. And I think that's absolutely true. Most people who believe in Christ do so because they've had a personal experience of the risen Lord. And there's nothing at all irrational about that. Apologetics helps to shape a cultural milieu in which the gospel can be heard as an intellectually viable option for thinking men and women. People may not come to Christ because of the arguments, but what the arguments and evidence do is they give people the intellectual permission to believe when their hearts are moved. And I think that that's a great accomplishment of apologetics.
William Lane Craig is really just the go-to scholar for quotes about how apologetics is by and large a comfort blanket and not so much a persuasion tool.
Rhett seems to think that it's strange that this evidence can actually persuade someone.
I don't think we can choose what persuades us. I've studied enough about epistemology to no longer be surprised what can be believed with precious little warrant. The strangeness here is any expectation that a mind can be changed.
And does apologetics actually change anybody's mind?
Exactly.
That's exactly what it did for me and several other people that I know. It's actually what led me to fully embrace Christianity.
I'm not questioning that. I don't know your story. I wouldn't accuse anyone of not being an atheist or no true skeptic fallacy or anything like that. But I will admit that this phrasing, it led me to fully embrace Christianity, implies that you were at least partially embracing Christianity before you looked into the evidence, which kind of affirms the model of intellectual permission for a non-intellectual belief that Craig affirms.
Now, it is true that not everyone looks at the intellectual reasons or the facts for their faith, but for those of us that do, the facts were actually a big part of why we landed on Christianity during our truth-seeking journeys.
See, again, not impugning anything, But you said the intellectual reasons were a big part, which means there were other factors. Speaking for myself, though I think I can speak for Rhett and many other former Christians who deconverted, the intellectual reasons were the only reason I left. I desperately tried to hold on with tears and a shouting. My entire motivation was to stay, not to leave. I lost so many relationships. I lost community. My only reward was intellectual honesty. And let me tell you, there were a lot of days where that was a hollow reward.
What is the benefit of like believing true stuff? Like sometimes there's not a ton of benefit there.
Sure, some people leave Christianity because they don't like the rules, or because of religious trauma, or the problem of evil, or some other non-argument reason. But speaking for myself, every time I crack open a new resurrection book, I'm not so secretly hoping that there will be something in the pages that could convince me again. I'd love to be wrong and come back to some flavor of Christianity, but I can tell you what kind of evidence won't do it. Testimony alone. It doesn't matter what your worldview is, testimony will always be more likely false or mistaken than affirm a miracle. Notice that the Apostle Paul himself also wasn't convinced by all the first century evidence for the resurrection and needed a personal experience for this stuff to become convincing. Maybe God could give me one of those?
But someone asked me, they're like, how would you describe apologetics in one word? And I said, love, when done correctly.
Honestly, I think counter-apologetics is exactly the same thing. This is the most loving thing I can do with my life. Be a cautionary tale of unexamined faith.
Listen, I've had friends who were high-profile Christians, and some of them deconverted, and they kind of went away quietly. They didn't make a big fuss about it. They didn't do a press tour about it. And I honestly respect that more.
You shouldn't. I'm currently convinced that the resurrection did not happen. And what does the Bible itself say about the resurrection being false?
1 Corinthians 15, verse 17 says, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied." So the reason why we have these conversations is because if the resurrection didn't happen, then Christians are the most to be pitied. And that really should be the temperament towards us, is pity us.
I do, though I might use the word empathize rather than pity. Given that I'm convinced that the resurrection didn't happen, I'm doing exactly what the Bible commands me to do in that circumstance. To quote the Apostle Paul, I've become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. Of course, I'm trying to save them from Paul, but you get my point.
Any final thoughts or reflections on watching this that we maybe missed?
Yeah, I found Rhett to be a very amiable and likable fellow. And honestly, my heart just breaks for him, Sean, when I see how he's rejected Christian faith so unnecessarily based upon a distorted web of Christian beliefs.
Distorted web of Christian beliefs? I had the same beliefs as Rhett, but when Bill responded to my deconversion, he said
that the intellectual life of this person was just allowed, well, it was stagnant. He had a brain dead Christian faith. I hope that maybe as a result of our interview today, if he watches it, that he might be provoked to look into some of these things more deeply and to ask himself if it really could be true.
I think we can safely say that Rhett has asked himself if it could possibly be true. But thanks for the suggestion. Thank you so much to all my patrons and members who make long videos like this one possible. If you support the mission of the Paulogia channel to providing a loving response to those still in Christianity, please consider joining for as little as $1 a month. Thank you so much, and thanks for watching. Till next time, later.